Welcome back to the deep dive. So today, we're going to get into something, something fascinating, I think. I'm really excited about this one.
Oh, good.
It's all about inheritance, but not just, like your grandma leaving you for China or, that sort of thing.
Right, right.
This is about inheritance systems, like all the ways that organisms pass on traits and information and, all this other stuff that shapes the next generation.
Yeah, I mean, when you hear inheritance, you immediately think genes, right? DNA.
Exactly.
But the stuff you sent me, it's clear that there's so much more to it than that.
Absolutely. It's like this whole hidden world of, like these intricate mechanisms that are operating beneath the surface.
Yeah.
And I think for our listeners, especially those with a philosophical bent, this deep dive could be a real mind bender.
Yeah, definitely. It's going to make you question, like, what does it even mean to inherit something, you know? Is it just about getting a blueprint from your parents, or is there something more dynamic going on?
Yeah.
Like, how much is actually passed on, and how does that even work?
Right. And, like, how do all these different systems, these inheritance systems, how do they all fit together?
Yeah.
And what does that tell us about the nature of, life itself?
Right.
Big questions.
Yeah, definitely big questions.
So I guess a good place to start would be just defining some terms. What exactly is the difference between heredity and inheritance?
Right. Good point. So heredity, you can think of that as the basic observation that offspring tend to resemble their parents.
Okay. Yeah. Like kids often look like their parents, right?
Yeah, exactly.
They might have similar mannerisms, certain tendencies.
Yeah, that's heredity. Just, the fact that there's this kind of reliable resemblance across generations.
Okay, I got it.
Inheritance, though, that's about the how. It's about all the different processes, the mechanisms that explain why offspring resemble their parents.
So it's like the underlying causes of heredity.
Exactly. So you could say, like, a tendency toward being really outgoing, that might be hereditary.
Right.
But the inheritance part is like, is it because of specific genes they got from their parents?
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe it's because of how they were raised, the environment they grew up in?
Right, right. So it's not just one thing, right?
No, not at all.
It can be multiple factors all working together.
Yeah, absolutely. It's usually a combination of things.
Okay, so that leads to another point you mentioned, this idea that multiple inheritance processes can contribute to a single trait.
Yeah, exactly.
Can you give us an example of that?
Sure. Take height, for instance.
Okay.
Obviously, genes play a big role in how tall someone will be.
Right.
But it's not just that. Like, nutrition during childhood is hugely important, too.
Mm-hmm.
And then you've got things like cultural practices around diet and healthcare. Those can influence the average height of a population over time.
And those practices can be passed down too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So you've got the genes, the access to good food, and even the cultural norms all contributing to something like height.
Wow, so it's like this whole web of influences.
Yeah.
Now, you also mentioned that inheritance can be thought of as information transmission.
Mm-hmm.
That concept always kind of gets me thinking, like, what does information even mean in a biological sense?
Yeah, it's a tricky one.
I mean, it makes sense when you think about genes, right? Like DNA carrying a code for building proteins and stuff.
Right.
But then when we start talking about other forms of inheritance, it gets a bit more abstract.
Yeah, definitely. Like, how do you quantify the information contained in a learned behavior, for example?
Right, exactly.
Or in the way a mother bird teaches her chicks to sing a particular song.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So it's clear that we need a broader way of thinking of information when we're talking about inheritance in general.
Okay, so we've established that inheritance is more than just genes. Now, this idea of non-genetic inheritance, it's not exactly brand new, right?
No, it's not. Even before we knew about DNA, there were scientists who observed stuff that didn't fit with the simple Mendelian view of genetics.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, like there's this thing called maternal inheritance, where certain traits are always passed down from the mother.
Mm.
And that suggested that there must be something else going on besides the chromosomes and the nucleus.
Right, right.
Like maybe there were hereditary factors in the cytoplasm of the cell.
Oh, okay. And this is where the research on paramecium comes in, right?
Yeah, exactly. In the mid-20th century, there were these researchers, Sunborn, Beal, Nanny. They did these really cool experiments with paramecium.
And paramecium, that's a single-celled organism, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
And they were looking at all sorts of traits like mating types, these things called serotypes, which are variations in surface proteins and even the structure of their cilia, the little hair-like things they use to move around.
Yeah.
And what they found was they could actually induce changes in the cilia.
Like experimentally.
Yeah, like physically altering them.
Wow.
And those changes would be inherited by the next generation of paramecium.
Really?
Yeah. And it wasn't because of changes in their DNA sequence.
So that's pretty strong evidence for some kind of non-genetic inheritance, right?
Exactly. It showed that heredity could operate through mechanisms that didn't involve changes to the DNA blueprint.
That's amazing.
And then there's this other thing they observed called cellular memory.
Cellular memory.
Yeah, so basically a cell could maintain a particular state, like a specific serotype, for many generations even after the initial trigger was removed.
So it's like the cell was remembering something.
Yeah, kind of. It was like a form of inheritance that didn't require any ongoing change to the DNA.
Wow. And these findings really paved the way for the whole concept of epigenetic inheritance, right?
Exactly. As more research was done, it became clear that there were all these heritable variations in gene activity in cellular states that couldn't be explained by changes in the DNA sequence itself.
Okay, so we've got this whole world of non-genetic inheritance opening up. And it's led to some different perspectives on how heredity works in general.
Right.
You mentioned these ideas of monism, holism, and multiple systems.
Yeah. So, when the structure of DNA was discovered, it was a huge deal.
Oh, yeah.
And it led to this kind of gene-centric view of biology.
Right, like genes are the be-all and end-all.
Exactly. And this was really pushed by people like Richard Dawkins with his idea of the replicator.
Right, the selfish gene.
Yeah. And the basic idea is that biological inheritance is all about the faithful transmission of genetic information.
Okay.
And anything else, any other form of inheritance, was either seen as not really that important or as ultimately reducible to genetic effects.
So that's the monist perspective, right? Like there's one fundamental way that heredity operates.
Exactly. And they often argue that only DNA truly meets the criteria of a replicator.
Meaning it's the only thing that's faithfully copied and passed down across multiple generations.
Right.
Okay, so how does that view handle something like mitochondrial inheritance?
Well, mitochondria, they have their own DNA, right?
Yeah.
So a monist might say, well, it still involves DNA, so it's not really a fundamentally different system. They might also argue that the really big evolutionary changes, the things that make organisms adapt to new environments, those are mainly driven by changes in nuclear genes, not mitochondrial genes.
Okay, so anything that's not directly DNA-based is either not really informational or just not that important in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, that's the general idea.
But then you've got this contrasting view, developmental systems theory, or DST.
Right, and DST is all about, the interconnectedness of development and inheritance.
So it's more holistic.
Yeah, exactly. It's saying that instead of focusing on these separate channels or systems of inheritance, we should think about development as this big, complex network of interactions.
Okay.
And anything that's reliably present across generations and contributes to the resemblance between parent and offspring, that's part of the inheritance process.
So it's not just DNA, but also like the cytoplasm of the egg, the environment, learned behaviors.
Yeah, all of that. And they argue that trying to separate out these different channels or systems is artificial.
Like we're imposing our own categories on something that's actually much more fluid.
Right.
Okay, and then there's the multiple inheritance systems view, which seems to fall somewhere in between.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. This view is really associated with Eva Jablonka and Marion Lamb. And they acknowledge that non-genetic inheritance is important.
Okay.
But they also want to identify and categorize the different mechanisms involved.
So it's like there are multiple ways that inheritance can happen, but they're not all just one big messy network.
Right. They're saying that each system has its own unique properties and its own evolutionary consequences.
Okay, so what are some of those systems?
Well, you've got epigenetic inheritance, of course. And then there's behavioral inheritance, like how animals learn from each other.
Right.
And then in humans, you've got symbolic inheritance, which is based on language and culture.
Okay, that makes sense. You also briefly mentioned the extended replicator approach.
Yeah, so that's kind of a response to DST.
Okay.
It tries to broaden the concept of the replicator to include non-genetic entities.
But it still maintains that distinction between replicators and interactors, right?
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay.
And they tend to have pretty strict criteria for what counts as a true replicator.
Like high-fidelity copying, transmission across many generations?
Exactly. So some of the non-genetic mechanisms might not quite fit that definition.
Like maybe they involve reconstruction rather than just strict copying?
Right. Or maybe they're influenced by the environment or social context.
Okay, that's helpful. Now, thinking about evolution, one of the key concepts is variation, right? The raw material for natural selection.
Yeah.
So, how do these different inheritance systems contribute to hereditary variation?
Well, each system has its own ways of generating and transmitting variation.
Right.
With genes, it's things like DNA mutation, recombination, horizontal gene transfer.
Right.
With epigenetic systems, you've got changes in DNA methylation, histone modifications, and RNA interference. Behavioral inheritance introduces variation through learning, social transmission, and innovation.
And then with symbolic inheritance, there's this whole explosion of ideas and information.
Exactly. So if we only focus on genetic mutations, we're missing out on a huge chunk of the picture.
Right. And you've also talked about this distinction between reproduction and replication. Why is that important in this context?
Well, the replicator-centric view, it's all about these entities that are copied with high fidelity, right?
Yeah.
But the multiple inheritance systems perspective, it often focuses on the reliable reproduction or reconstruction of phenotypes.
So it's not just about copying a blueprint, but about rebuilding an organism with similar traits.
Exactly.
And that rebuilding process can involve a lot of different factors.
Yeah, absolutely. Like genes are important, but so are epigenetic marks, learned behaviors, even the environment itself.
Okay, so this view challenges the idea that DNA replication is both necessary and sufficient for all forms of heredity.
Exactly. DNA replication is crucial for genetic inheritance, but it's not the whole story.
Right.
Like with cellular heredity, you have epigenetic mechanisms that maintain stable patterns of gene expression, even though the DNA sequence isn't changing. And cellular epigenetic inheritance is also really important for cell differentiation.
Right, how different cell types develop from a single genome.
Yeah, and those differentiated states are inherited through cell lineages.
So that contributes to the overall complexity of an organism. Now, you also mentioned James Griesmer and his reproducer concept.
Yeah, so Griesmer was trying to come up with a more general framework for thinking about reproduction and evolution.
Okay.
And he defines a reproducer as something that multiplies with material overlap between parent and offspring and transmits the capacity for future reproduction.
So it's not just passing on static traits, but also the potential for development and further reproduction.
Right. And he argues that both inheritance and replication are actually specific cases of this more general phenomenon of reproduction.
Interesting. So how does that apply to, say, epigenetic inheritance?
Well, Griesmer would say that epigenetic inheritance is a form of inheritance, but not necessarily replication.
Because it might involve reconstruction rather than strict template-based copying.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, we've touched on this idea of information in inheritance. And as you said, it's kind of a tricky concept to pin down.
Yeah, it's one of those things that seems obvious at first, but then the more you think about it, the more slippery it gets.
Right. And there's the DST parity argument that challenges the idea that DNA is somehow uniquely informational.
Yeah, DST argues that all of the inherited developmental resources, whether it's DNA, the cytoplasm, the environment, they all play essential roles in development.
So they're all on equal footing in terms of their informational contribution.
Exactly.
But then you mentioned Paul Griffiths and his idea of causal specificity.
Yeah, so Griffiths is trying to bring a more rigorous information theoretic approach to this whole debate.
Okay.
And he focuses on the idea of causal specificity. Like how much does a particular factor determine a specific developmental outcome? And he argues that this can be applied to things like epigenetic marks and non-coding DNA regions that have specific effects on development.
Okay, so it's a way of measuring the informational content of different factors based on how much they actually shape the phenotype?
Exactly.
And then Jablonka has her own definition of hereditary information.
Right. She defines it as the transmissible organization of an actual or potential state of a system. And that's a pretty broad definition. But it's meant to encompass all the different ways that information can be stored and transmitted across generations.
So it's a framework for comparing different inheritance systems.
Yeah.
Okay, so with all that in mind, how do we actually classify these different systems?
Well, Jablonka and Lamb have a pretty detailed classification scheme.
Okay.
But before we get into that, It's important to distinguish between inheritance channels and inheritance systems.
Okay, so channels are the routes of transmission, and systems are the underlying mechanisms.
Exactly.
So a single trait could be influenced by multiple channels, and a single channel could involve multiple systems.
Right. Like, think about how a fertilized egg develops into a whole organism.
Okay.
You've got the nuclear genome being inherited, but you've also got mitochondrial DNA coming from the cytoplasm.
So those are two different channels.
Yeah. And within the nuclear genome, you've got the DNA sequence itself being copied, but you've also got epigenetic modifications being inherited.
So those are two different systems operating within the same channel.
Exactly.
Okay, that's a really important distinction. So what are the main categories of inheritance systems according to Jablonka and Lamb?
You have four main categories: the genetic inheritance system, epigenetic inheritance systems, behavioral inheritance systems, and the symbolic inheritance system.
Okay, let's start with the familiar one, the genetic inheritance system.
Right. So the GIS is all about DNA, the sequence of nucleotides.
Mm-hmm.
It's a coded system using the genetic code to translate DNA into proteins and RNA.
Right.
And it's organized in a modular way, meaning you can change individual nucleotides without affecting the whole thing.
Okay.
And it has what's called unlimited heredity.
Because you can have such a huge variety of DNA sequences.
Exactly.
And the source of new variation in this system is generally thought to be random mutations, right?
Yeah, although there's some debate about whether certain mutations might be more likely in certain environments or under certain conditions.
Okay, interesting. Now, on to epigenetic inheritance systems.
Right, so this is a really diverse category.
Mm-hmm.
It includes things like cell-sustaining metabolic loops, structural templating, chromatin marking, and RNA silencing.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, it is. And what's interesting is that many of these mechanisms are sort of piggybacking on other cellular processes.
Okay.
But DNA methylation is different. It has its own dedicated machinery.
Mm-hmm.
And epigenetic inheritance is often more holistic than genetic inheritance.
Meaning?
It's not always easy to break it down into these neat, independent units.
Okay.
And the range of possible variations might be more limited for a single epigenetic mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
But a single cell can have lots of these mechanisms operating at the same time.
So that increases the potential for variation.
Exactly.
And some of these epigenetic changes can be passed down across multiple generations, right?
Yeah, that's transgenerational epigenetic inheritance.
Mm-hmm.
And although it might not be as stable as genetic inheritance, it can still have a big impact on evolution.
Okay, fascinating. Now, what about behavioral inheritance systems?
So this is all about how animals learn and how that learning can be transmitted across generations.
Okay.
And there are three main modes of behavioral inheritance.
Mm-hmm.
One is the inheritance of substances that affect behavior, like how food preferences can be passed down through the placenta or through milk.
Interesting.
Then there's non-imitative social learning, where animals learn from each other without directly copying.
Okay.
Like the famous example of the blue tits in the UK that learned to open milk bottles.
Right, I've heard about that.
And then there's imitation and instruction, which can be very complex and often involves specialized cognitive abilities.
Mm-hmm.
And a key thing about behavioral inheritance is that it can happen horizontally.
Meaning between individuals within a generation, not just from parent to offspring.
Exactly.
Okay, and finally we have the symbolic inheritance system.
Right. So this is mainly found in humans,
Mm-hmm.
and it's based on language and other symbolic systems. And it shares some features with the GIS.
Mm-hmm.
Modularity, unlimited variability, coded information, latent information.
Right.
But it also has connections to behavioral inheritance.
Because it can be transmitted horizontally and it's influenced by learning and context.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that cultural evolution through the SIS is not just about copying memes.
It's about active reconstruction of information.
Right.
Okay, so we've got all these different systems. Now, you also mentioned niche construction theory and ecological inheritance.
Yeah, so niche construction theory is about how organisms modify their environments.
Yeah.
And those modifications can then be inherited by future generations.
So like a beaver building a dam, it's not just changing its own environment, it's also changing the environment for its offspring.
Exactly.
And that's ecological inheritance.
Right. And it's different from genetic inheritance in a few ways.
Yeah, good.
It's transmitted through the external environment, not through reproduction.
Okay.
It doesn't necessarily involve discrete replicators,
Mm-hmm.
and it can be a continuous process affecting many organisms over time.
Okay, that's really interesting. Now, what are some of the implications of this broader view of inheritance for development and evolution?
Well, for one thing, it raises a lot of questions about how these different systems interact.
Right, like how do they influence each other during development?
Exactly.
How do they regulate each other?
Yeah.
And how do the systems themselves evolve?
Right. And then there's the question of how non-genetic inheritance can influence evolution.
Hmm.
Like it can create feedback loops with natural selection.
Okay.
And it might even lead to the genetic assimilation of initially non-genetic adaptations.
So it's like the environment can shape the genes over time.
Yeah, in a way.
And this challenges the idea that evolution is all about random mutations and natural selection. Right?
Exactly. Jablonka and Lamb argue that evolution can happen through any of these inheritance systems.
Okay.
And they emphasize the role of instructive processes,
Yeah.
where the environment or behavior can actually induce heritable changes.
So it's not all about random chance.
Right.
And what about the question of the units of selection?
Yeah, that gets even more complicated with multiple inheritance systems.
Because you could have selection operating at different levels.
Exactly. On genes, on epigenetic states, on behaviors, on cultural practices.
Wow. So it's not just about individual organisms anymore.
Right. Some people argue for selection on lineages of traits, while others focus on selection on different types of replicators.
Okay, that's a lot to think about. You also mentioned this idea of scaffolding.
Yeah, so scaffolding is about how one inheritance system can provide support for another.
Like the genes building the brain that's necessary for learning.
Exactly.
And that kind of multi-channel inheritance might be necessary for the evolution of complex traits.
Right.
And then there's the fact that inheritance systems themselves develop, right?
Yeah, they don't just appear out of nowhere.
Like the ability to imitate that develops over time and depends on other factors.
Exactly. So it's not just a channel for cultural inheritance, it's also a product of it.
Interesting. And we see this interconnectedness in the fact that even genetic inheritance relies on epigenetic mechanisms. So the lines between these systems are not always so clear-cut.
Exactly.
Now let's talk about assimilation.
Okay.
Things like the Baldwin effect and genetic assimilation.
Right. So these are about how non-genetic changes can actually become encoded in the genome over time.
Okay.
So imagine an organism that develops a new behavior or a physiological adaptation in response to some environmental challenge. And this adaptation helps them survive and reproduce.
Okay.
So now there's a selective pressure for genes that make that adaptation more likely or more efficient.
Right.
And over time, that adaptation might become less dependent on the environment and more genetically determined.
So it's like the environment is guiding the evolution of the genes.
Yeah, kind of. And this is often seen in cases of niche construction.
Like the lactase persistence example.
Exactly. The cultural practice of dairy farming created a selective pressure for genes that allow people to digest lactose as adults.
So it's a case of gene culture coevolution.
Right. And this whole process has a bit of a Lamarckian flavor to it.
Because it's like the acquired trait is being inherited.
Yeah, although the mechanisms are still Darwinian at the core.
Okay, that's fascinating. And finally, what about the evolution of inheritance systems themselves?
Well, there are a few ideas out there.
Okay.
Some people think that epigenetic inheritance might have evolved to allow for faster adaptation to changing environments.
Because it's more flexible than genetic inheritance.
Right.
Maynard Smith and Zathmary argued that major evolutionary transitions often involve a shift towards more reliable and open-ended inheritance systems. But Jablonka and Lamb emphasize the role of non-genetic inheritance, especially epigenetic inheritance, in those same transitions.
Exactly. And Manny even suggested that epigenetic inheritance might have been important in the early stages of cell specialization.
Interesting.
And then there's the idea that the evolution of better repair mechanisms in genetic systems might have limited the scope of other systems.
Okay.
Because they're less likely to get passed on if they're constantly being repaired.
Right.
And then there are Stirling's-Hoyle conditions for evolvable inheritance systems.
Which the genetic system comes closest to meeting.
Yeah, but Griesmer and others have argued that those conditions might themselves be products of evolution.
Okay.
And that they might be met in a more distributed way across different systems.
Interesting. And you mentioned the relationship between population properties and inheritance system characteristics.
Yeah, so things like population size and mating strategies can influence how inheritance systems evolve.
Okay.
And Darlington did some work on the evolution of the genetic system itself.
Like the way that chromosomes are organized?
Yeah, and he linked that to mating habits and reproductive isolation.
Wow, so it's all connected.
Yeah, it really is.
Well, this has been an amazing deep dive.
Yeah, it's been fun.
I think the main takeaway for me is that inheritance is so much more than just genes.
Yeah, definitely.
It's this whole complex web of interacting systems.
Right.
And for our listeners who are, into philosophy, this really challenges some basic assumptions about transmission and continuity.
Exactly. It makes you question what it even means to inherit something.
Yeah, and how much of who we are is actually determined by what we inherit.
Right.
It really blurs the lines between nature and nurture,
Mm.
and it raises questions about agency and responsibility.
Yeah, like how much control do we really have over who we become?
Right. And how do we think about the inheritance of ideas and values?
Yeah, that's a whole other layer.
It's a lot to ponder.
It is. And there's still so much we don't know.
Right. This is a really active area of research.
Yeah.
There's still so much to discover.
Absolutely.
Well, we hope this deep dive has given you some new things to think about.
Yeah, we hope you enjoyed it.
And as always, keep questioning.